This is the story of Balaam, a man gifted by God to speak blessings and curses, known by kings and feared by nations. But though his words were powerful, his heart was divided. This is a story of greed disguised as obedience, of warnings ignored, and of how serving God with a greedy heart leads to destruction. Because half obedience is still disobedience, and even a prophet can be blind to what truly matters. The flickering oil lamps cast long shadows across Balaam's chamber as a storm rolled low across the hills of Pether. Thunder rumbled in the distance like a growling beast, but Balaam didn't look up from his scrolls. "Gold," he muttered, running his fingers along a list of names and symbols etched into parchment. So much gold, promised for so few words. The walls of his stone house were lined with hanging charms and carved idols, tokens from kings who had paid dearly for his blessings and curses. But above them all, a single symbol was painted in faded red across the ceiling, the name of the God of Israel. He didn't speak that name often, only when necessary, only when the job was too big for the other gods. A voice called from outside, "Master Balaam!" He rose, draping a dark cloak over his shoulders and stepping to the door. Outside, 2 messengers stood in the rain, soaked and shivering. Behind them, 6 camels, their packs gleaming with ornaments, coins, and colored silks. "We come from Balak, king of Moab," the first messenger said, bowing deeply. "He has a request of great urgency." Balaam tilted his head. "What kind of urgency jingles when it walks?" The second messenger held up a sealed scroll. "The Israelites. They've come out of Egypt, and they're unstoppable. Our king fears they will devour everything." "And?" Balaam asked, already guessing. The first messenger looked around nervously. "He wants you to curse them, drive them back with your words." Balaam held the scroll, feeling the weight of its seal and the weight of what it meant. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," he said. But the king— "Tomorrow," Balaam repeated, then turned sharply and walked inside. That night, the storm passed. But inside his home, a different kind of storm began to stir. Balaam unrolled the scroll beside the fire, letting the gold coins spill from the messenger's pouch beside it. He stared at the name scrawled in the king's hand, Israelites. "Why them?" he whispered. "Why always them?" He rose slowly, stepped into his back chamber, and knelt before the faded red symbol on the ceiling. He hesitated, then whispered, "God of Israel, what would you have me do?" A long silence followed. Then a voice, soft but clear, spoke into his heart. "Do not go with them. Do not curse these people. They are blessed." Balaam opened his eyes. He sat back, and for a moment he felt peace, until he glanced again at the gold and wondered. But what if I asked again? The morning came clear and bright, with no sign of last night's storm. The messengers waited near the camels, watching the smoke rise from Balaam's chimney. At last, the prophet emerged. He didn't look hurried. He didn't look troubled. He looked calculated. "The Lord God has spoken," Balaam said, his voice steady. "You may return to King Balak with this message. I cannot curse the people of Israel. They are already blessed." The messengers exchanged confused glances. "But what about the gold?" one muttered. Balaam's lips twitched. "My answer is final." And with that, he turned away. But even as he walked back into his home, his hand brushed the pouch of coins still resting on the table. He hadn't returned it. 2 days later, the second knock came. This time, it was louder, heavier. And when Balaam opened the door, a much larger group of nobles stood waiting. Their robes shimmered with embroidery, their camels were draped in jewels, and their message was even clearer. Balak says, "Do not let anything keep you from coming to him." A chest of gold coins was opened before Balaam's eyes. "This will be yours, if you curse Israel." Balaam's eyes flickered with something hard to name. "You may spend the night," he said slowly. "I'll speak with the Lord again." That night, Balaam knelt beneath the red-painted name of God once more. He already knew the answer. He had heard it before, but still. He asked. And this time, God's voice came again. "Go with them, but only do what I tell you." Balaam smiled, not because he was joyful, but because he had what he wanted. At sunrise, Balaam packed his bags. His servant saddled his donkey. The royal men waited, smug and satisfied. "Master Balaam," one said, "did your God change his mind?" Balaam said nothing, but in his heart, a strange silence echoed. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that comes when someone has stopped listening. As the group rode off into the hills, the sky above them was cloudless. But the road ahead would not stay smooth for long, because the God who speaks also sees the heart. And Balaam's heart was leaning more toward gold than toward God. The morning sun glared off the rocky path as Balaam rode ahead of the Moabite officials, his eyes fixed forward, his thoughts tangled. He was going to see a king. He was going to be honored. And maybe, just maybe, he could still find a way to obey God and earn the reward. "Half obedience," he muttered to himself. "It's still something." But the road ahead was not as empty as it seemed. Unseen to Balaam, a mighty angel of the Lord stood in the path, sword drawn, face like lightning, eyes burning with holy fire. The donkey froze, and then turned sharply into a nearby field. "Hey!" Balaam shouted, yanking the reins. "Get back on the road." He beat the animal with his staff. Grumbling nobles behind him exchanged awkward glances. A few steps later, the path narrowed between two vineyard walls. Again, the angel appeared. And again, the donkey saw him. It swerved and scraped Balaam's foot against the stone. "Ah, you stupid beast!" Balaam cried, striking it again. The donkey brayed in pain. The servants looked away, pretending not to notice. Then came the third time. The road tightened through a mountain pass. No room to turn, no place to run. And there, the angel stood once more. This time, the donkey collapsed beneath Balaam, refused to move, and Balaam exploded. "You worthless, lazy animal!" he shouted, beating it furiously. "I should kill you right now." And then the donkey spoke with a clear, calm voice. "Why are you beating me? Have I ever acted this way before?" Balaam blinked, his jaw dropped. You're talking." The donkey turned its head slightly. "Yes, and I've carried you for years. Why don't you ask why I stopped?" Before Balaam could answer, his eyes were opened. And there, glorious, terrifying, stood the angel of the Lord, sword raised, blocking the path. Balaam slid off the donkey and fell face down in the dust. The angel spoke. "Why have you struck your donkey? I was sent to stop you. Your path is reckless." "If your donkey hadn't turned aside," the angel added, "you would be dead." Balaam trembled. I have sinned, he said. Should I turn back? The angel stared at him. Go on, but speak only what God tells you. The angel vanished. The donkey snorted, and Balaam climbed back on, shaken to his core, but deep down, the wrestling hadn't stopped because he still wanted the gold, and that desire would not stay silent for long. Would you like to continue with part 4, where Balaam finally meets King Balak and the pressure to curse Israel becomes heavier than ever before? You're finally here, Balak said, his voice dry. Balaam dismounted slowly. I came as you asked. Balak's eyes narrowed. And you'll curse them, as I asked too. Balaam didn't answer right away. He looked past the king, toward the rising hills where the Israelite tents lay like patches of snow in the distance. I can only speak what God puts in my mouth, he said carefully. Balak laughed once, but it wasn't a happy sound. We'll see about that. That night, Balak hosted a feast in Balaam's honor. Roasted lamb, golden wine, dancers with silver veils. The king pulled out every charm of the royal court. But Balaam barely touched his plate. He stared at the stars instead. Keturah's voice echoed in his memory from long ago. Gold isn't worth much if it costs your soul. And yet, the gold glimmered near his seat. Waiting. At dawn, Balak led Balaam to a high place, Bamoth Baal, where sacrifices to false gods were made. Build 7 altars, Balaam instructed. Offer 7 bulls and 7 rams. Balak nodded, eager. Once the offerings were burned, Balaam stood at the edge of the ridge and looked out over Israel's camp. Then he stepped aside to listen. The wind stirred, and the word of the Lord came. Balaam returned and stood before Balak. The king leaned forward. Well? And Balaam opened his mouth, but not to curse, to bless. How can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? From the rocky peaks I see them, a people who dwell apart and do not consider themselves like other nations. Balak's face turned red. What are you doing? He snapped. You were brought here to curse them, not bless them. Balaam held up his hands. I told you, I can only speak what the Lord gives me. Balak hissed through his teeth. Fine. Come. We'll try from a different place. Maybe God will let you curse them from there. As Balaam followed the king to the next hill, something inside him twisted. He had done what was right, but why did he feel so torn? Because in his heart, he still hoped for both, the blessing of God and the reward of men. And he hadn't yet learned, you can't chase both. We'll get a better view here, he said over his shoulder. Just enough to see part of their camp, not the whole thing. Maybe then your God won't get so protective. Balaam didn't respond. He just watched. Watched how the king's crown tilted as he hurried. Watched how his hands clenched with frustration. Watched. And wondered how far this man was willing to go to bend the will of God. At the top of the ridge, they built 7 more altars, 7 more bulls, 7 more rams. Fire licked the sky as smoke curled into the morning sun. Balaam stepped away again to listen. He knew what God would say. But still, part of him waited. Waited for permission. Waited for a loophole. Waited for any chance to speak what he thought Balak wanted to hear without losing heaven's favor. The Lord's voice came again, firm, unmoving, clear. You shall bless them. And when Balaam returned to Balak, his voice shook slightly, but his words were sure. God is not a man that he should lie, nor a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot reverse it. Balak nearly ripped his robe in half. Stop. If you won't curse them, then at least don't bless them. But Balaam answered quietly, I must do what the Lord tells me. Balak turned away, fists clenched. Fine. One more place. Just one. Balaam raised an eyebrow. You still think the view changes the verdict? But Balak didn't answer. He was already storming down the path. As Balaam followed, he glanced at the sky. No clouds, no signs, no burning bush, just the whisper of the same truth. You cannot curse what God has blessed. And yet, deep inside, Balaam still hoped he might find a way to walk the line. But lines drawn by God are not meant to be walked, they are meant to be obeyed. Mount Peor was steeper than the last two, its jagged edges carved like teeth into the sky. From its peak, the entire camp of Israel stretched below them, millions of tents glistening like a blanket of stars laid across the valley. Balak pointed furiously. Look at them! Countless, spreading like locusts. You must curse them from here. Surely your God will allow it now. Balaam said nothing. He simply nodded toward his attendants. 7 altars, again. Balak sighed. Must we? If we do this, we do it properly. So once more, they prepared the sacrifices. 7 bulls, 7 rams, flames rising into the sky. Balaam stood apart again, walking a few paces from the smoke, turning his face to the wind. But this time, something changed. The Spirit of God came upon him with power, not just words, not just warning, a vision. His eyes opened, his heart thundered, and he began to speak, not to Balak, not to the nobles, but into the wind, into the world, into the future. How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord. God brought them out of Egypt. They have the strength of a wild ox. There is no divination against Jacob, no evil omen against Israel. The Lord their God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. Balak's face went pale. He took a step back as if the words burned him. Stop, he hissed. Enough. Go home, Balaam. I brought you here to curse my enemies, and 3 times you've blessed them. Balaam turned to face the king, his eyes still glowing from what he had seen. I warned you, he said. I told you I could only speak what the Lord puts in my mouth. Balak's voice cracked. Then leave. You'll get nothing from me, not gold, not silver, not even a thank you. Balaam smiled sadly. I didn't come for your gold. But deep down, he had hoped for it. As Balaam turned to descend the mountain, the Spirit of God stirred once more. One final message was rising in his throat. One that Balak hadn't asked for, and one that Balaam didn't know he'd be brave enough to speak until now. Balaam had already turned to leave Mount Peor, but then he stopped. The Spirit of God pressed on his heart again, stronger than before. He slowly turned back toward Balak, who had started pacing near the altar ruins, muttering curses under his breath. King Balak, Balaam said loudly. The king looked up, startled. What now? I'm not finished. Balak's eyes narrowed. You dare speak again? Balaam didn't answer. He stepped forward, his eyes clouded and distant, as though he was no longer looking at the tents below, but into something far, far beyond them. This is the message of Balaam, son of Beor, the man whose eyes are opened, the one who hears the words of God, who sees a vision from the Almighty. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise from Israel. He will crush the foreheads of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom will be conquered. Israel will grow strong. The mountain was silent. Even the wind had stopped. Balak's hands trembled. What are you saying? Balaam blinked. The vision faded, and he sighed. I'm saying that the people you hate will rise. A king will come from them, one you cannot stop, one whose reign will stretch farther than you can imagine. Balak stumbled back. Leave! I'm going, Balaam said. But before turning away, he looked into the king's eyes. You cannot curse what God has blessed, but you can destroy yourself trying. As Balaam descended the mountain, something inside him twisted. He had spoken truth, he had obeyed mostly, but the pull of the reward, the temptation, still clung to his mind like dust to sandals. His words had honored God. But what about his heart? That part was still unclear. And while Balaam walked away from the mountaintop, sin was already slithering through the camp of Israel, and Balaam's greatest test had not yet come. The sun dipped low as Balaam reached the edge of Moabite territory. Behind him, the altars still smoldered. Ahead, the path home wound through dry hills and quiet shadows. But Balaam didn't keep walking. Not yet. A royal servant approached quietly. The king is waiting at the lower camp, he said. One last request. Balaam hesitated, then turned and followed. Inside a lavish tent near the river, King Balak stood over a map, fury still in his face, but a gleam of desperation in his eye. You cursed me instead of cursing them, he said without looking up. But I wonder. He tapped the parchment with a jeweled finger. Is there another way? Balaam crossed his arms. God already said Israel is blessed. Yes, Balak said, but what if they were no longer walking in that blessing? Balaam's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Balak leaned in. Your God is holy, isn't he? He demands purity, obedience, separation. Balaam nodded slowly. Balak smiled. So what happens if they sin? That night, Balaam tossed and turned in his tent. He had obeyed God's command, technically. He hadn't spoken curses. He hadn't defied the visions, but now a new thought stirred. One that sounded wise. What if, instead of speaking curses, he could help Moab tempt Israel into cursing themselves? After all, he wouldn't be doing anything, would he? The next day, a message was sent to Balak. Send your women to dance among them. Invite the Israelites to feast with your gods. Let them forget who they belong to. It was not prophecy. It was not command. It was strategy. And it came not from the voice of God, but from the heart of a man who wanted to serve God and serve his own desire. Soon Moabite women entered the outskirts of the Israelite camp, with food, with smiles, with flattery. And the men, many of them, welcomed the attention. They feasted. They bowed to Moab's idols, and before long, plague fell like fire among the people of God. Balaam watched from a hilltop. He didn't speak, he didn't smile, but he also didn't stop it. And so the one who refused to curse became the reason the curse came anyway. Smoke rose from the Israelite camp, but it was no longer the smoke of sacrifices. It was the bitter haze of judgment. The plague had spread fast. By morning, thousands were dead. The elders wept outside their tents. Mothers clung to their sons. Priests cried out for mercy, tearing their garments, pouring ashes on their heads. And through it all, Balaam stood on a distant ridge, watching. He said nothing. He did nothing. Because in his mind, he hadn't broken God's command. He hadn't spoken a curse. He hadn't lifted a hand. He had simply suggested. And yet, in the valley below, his whisper had become a wildfire. In the center of the Israelite camp, Moses fell to his knees in grief. "We have sinned," he whispered. "Lord, forgive us." Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, stood nearby, his eyes burning with righteous fury. "They've brought idols into the camp," he said, "and with them death." Then came the final straw. A man, an Israelite leader, led a Moabite woman past the tent of meeting, proudly, boldly, as if God's law no longer applied. That was enough. Phinehas grabbed a spear and ran. By nightfall, the plague had stopped, not because of magic, not because of rituals, but because one man had stood up and said, "No more." The silence afterward was heavy. A silence filled with grief, regret, and one unspoken question: how had this happened? Far from the camp, Balaam sat beside a fire. Balak had gone home, smug and satisfied. The gold had been delivered, quietly, in cloth bags, slipped under Balaam's tent in the night. He ran his hands over one of them, and still, he didn't smile. Because deep down, the question echoed in his own heart: what have I done? But it was too late to take it back. Too late to rewrite the moment. Too late to undo what his words and silence had allowed. And though God's fire had stopped burning in Israel's camp, it had only just begun to move toward his own. The gold lay untouched in Balaam's tent. For all his scheming, all his prayers for reward, it brought no peace. Not when he heard the news. "They know," his servant whispered, breathless from the run. "Moses knows it was your idea." Balaam didn't move. He just stared at the flickering fire. "How?" he asked softly. The women confessed. So did the man who brought her into the camp. They said they were told. "That you—" "I heard you," Balaam cut in. He closed his eyes. It had only taken a suggestion, a single compromise, a little push. And now, the whole mountain knew. The next day, a cloud of dust appeared across the plain. It was an army. Israel had marched, not just to defend, but to judge. In the land of Midian, panic spread. "Get the elders," voices cried. "Call the seers, burn offerings, do something." Balaam stood by the city gates as people rushed past him. He had once been greeted with applause, with honor, with awe. Now they looked through him, around him. No one wanted advice from a prophet who'd been outwitted by his own God. Balak had vanished into his palace, locking the gates. Cowards always hide when truth marches close. Balaam took one final walk through the market. He saw the idols, the dancers, the altars that had lured Israel to ruin. He had helped build this. And now, even the gold in his pouch felt like poison. He turned to his servant. "Leave," he said. Take the horses. Go north. Start over." The servant blinked. "What about you?" "I'm staying." "Why?" Balaam looked at the horizon, at the dust rising, at the army that now carried the holiness of God. "Because I chose this," he said, "and judgment is coming." Back in Israel's camp, Moses stood before his people. "Go to war," he said. "Strike down those who sought to destroy us, not with swords, but with seduction." And in his heart, he remembered the name Balaam, a man once chosen by God to speak blessing, now remembered for betrayal. The sound of ram's horns echoed across the plains of Midian, long, low, and rising. Balaam stood atop a watchtower, robes blowing in the wind, watching the Israelite army draw near. Their campfires burned steady behind them. Their banners rose high. And in front of them marched the Ark of the Covenant, glowing like fire beneath the sun. He swallowed hard. "This is different," he muttered. A Midianite general stood beside him, armor rattling. "They've come for blood." "They've come for justice," Balaam corrected quietly. Down below, soldiers scrambled. Women and children fled to caves. Elders chanted in fear. The priests of Baal gathered incense, waving it frantically as though smoke could stop a holy army. Balaam turned to the general. "Tell your men to lay down their weapons. They cannot win." "You'll help us," the general insisted. "You've cursed before." "I never did," Balaam interrupted. "That's the problem. I blessed them, and then I broke myself trying to twist the blessing afterward." The general's eyes narrowed. "Then what good are you?" Balaam didn't answer, because the answer was already written in fire on the horizon. Inside his tent, Balaam unwrapped the last pouch of gold. He poured it into a clay bowl and stared at the coins. So much effort, so many words, so many altars. All for this. He picked up a single coin and studied his reflection, and for the first time in years, he looked ashamed. Outside, the first arrows flew. Shouts erupted. Israel had entered the valley. Midian's lines broke within minutes. The battle wasn't a battle, it was a cleansing. Fast, righteous, swift. Balaam stepped out into the chaos, unarmed. He didn't run, he didn't hide. He simply walked into the dust, not toward safety, but toward the soldiers he had once tried to outwit with prophecy and parables. He passed burning tents, collapsed altars, idols crushed beneath sandals. And then he saw the faces of Israel, not afraid, not confused, but focused, eyes fixed, justice alive in their stride. One soldier raised a sword. Balaam didn't flinch. "Do what must be done," he whispered. Because at that moment, he finally understood. Disobedience may begin as a whisper, but it ends with a sword. The battle was over before nightfall. Midian had fallen. The idols lay in pieces, the temples scorched, and among the fallen was Balaam, his staff snapped in two beside him, his robes torn by wind and dust. He hadn't run, he hadn't begged, but neither had he repented. He died not as a prophet on a mountain, but as a man caught in the very trap he helped set. Days later, Moses stood before the people of Israel. The elders gathered, the warriors cleaned their blades. The Levites readied the camp to move once more. And Moses spoke Balaam's name, not in honor, but as a reminder. "Do not follow the way of Balaam," he said, "who loved the wages of unrighteousness. He had once stood on mountaintops. He had once heard the voice of God. He had once blessed the people of Israel, but his heart had been divided. And a divided heart cannot stand. Years passed. Generations grew up in the promised land. But the name of Balaam lingered. Not for his visions, not for his poems, not for his moments of obedience, but for the moment he tried to keep God's blessing and still chase the world's reward. In the New Testament, his name surfaced again. Peter warned of those who followed the way of Balaam. Jude wrote of those who rushed for profit like Balaam did. And in Revelation, Jesus himself called out a church for allowing the teaching of Balaam, compromise wrapped in spirituality. The man was long gone, but his legacy still taught, still warned, still whispered. You cannot serve two masters, but Balaam's story is not just a tale of failure. It is a mirror, a warning, a call to search the heart and ask, is God my reward, or just a way to get what I really want? Because God does not share his glory, and he does not bless divided loyalty. The valley where Balaam fell grew quiet. Ashes cooled. The wind carried away the last of the smoke. And Israel, bloodied, humbled, and wiser, turned their eyes forward again. They had grieved. They had repented. And now, it was time to move. Moses stood before the people one final time before the next journey. The sun behind him made his white hair shine like a crown. He spoke of the law, of holiness, of obedience, but he also spoke of Balaam. He was a man who saw visions of God, Moses said, yet he loved reward more than righteousness. He tried to use the truth, but the truth used him. A hush fell over the crowd. Let his story be a warning. God cannot be bribed, his word cannot be twisted, and his blessing cannot be sold. The people nodded, not in fear, but in understanding, because they had learned the real danger doesn't always come with spears or soldiers. Sometimes it comes with words wrapped in cleverness. Sometimes it comes from within. Still, the mercy of God did not depart. A cloud still led them by day. A fire still burned by night. And though they had been wounded, they had also been restored. Because God had not left them. He had fought for them, and he would still lead them home. Among the younger generation, children gathered near the elders to hear the story again. How a prophet tried to curse, but could only bless. How a donkey spoke more wisdom than a king. How God watches, always, guiding, warning, protecting. And from those ashes, a new strength grew. Not one of pride, but of humility, and hearts that remembered even when people fail. God does not. Years passed, the land changed hands, battles were fought and won, but the name of Balaam stayed. It lingered in stories told beside campfires. It echoed in the teachings of prophets. It was remembered not because of his greatness, but because of his compromise. In synagogues and scrolls, the tale was repeated. A prophet with clear vision, but a clouded heart. A man who heard God and still chose greed. A man who stood on mountains and blessed with his mouth, but betrayed with his actions. His legacy wasn't sealed with curses. It wasn't sealed with power. It was sealed with a warning that even the most gifted among us, those who see visions, speak truth, and carry spiritual authority, can fall if their hearts are divided. God had used Balaam, God had spoken through him, but Balaam had still fallen short. Why? Because God delights in obedience, not just outward words, but inward surrender. Because truth is not just something to speak, it's something to live. And so, Balaam became more than a man in Scripture. He became a mirror held up to every heart. Asking the question, will you follow God with your whole heart or only when it pays well? The Israelites crossed into the Promised Land. They fought new battles. They wrote new chapters. But Balaam's story was never forgotten. Not because he was the hero, but because his story warned them and us that partial obedience is full disobedience, and half-hearted faith is no faith at all. So now, when people read of Balaam, they don't remember his altars or his poetry or his mountain views. They remember this: you cannot curse what God has blessed, but you can lose everything trying to get around it. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of Balaam's story is not that he died by the sword, but that he could have finished well. He could have become one of the greats, but he settled for gold instead of glory, and that is why his name remains. Not just as a warning from the past, but as a choice in the present. Who will you serve? The God of truth, or the promise of reward? Because even today, the voice of God still speaks, and the lesson of Balaam still stands. Don't serve God with a greedy heart, because half obedience is still disobedience. Greedy heart, because half obedience is still disobedience.